Well, let me kick this thing off. So we're obviously kicking off our next digital identity story here with Robert Prigge from Jumio, which is great. And want to thank Robert for being here today and enjoying his company as always. I've known Robert for many years and always enjoy talking with Robert and spending time with him and talking about the industry and families and what's going on there. So he's been generous enough to join me today and talk about some things we're looking at from trends in the digital identity market. And so I'd love for Robert to maybe introduce himself, talk a little about his background coming into the space, and a little bit of his professional background before we jump into it. So I'll leave it over to you, Robert.
Thanks, Garrett. Very happy to be here as part of Digital Identity Stories. My name is Robert Prigge, the CEO of Jumio. Been with the company well over 6 years now. Jumio has just used my identity online, and we helped kind of birth the space. Ultimately, we're the way that companies establish trust remotely with a single or simple API call. People are able to do ID verification, KYC, KYB, AML, as well as orchestration. So I'm a big believer in identity. My mission, my wife had her identity stolen prior to me joining Jumio. So it's a topic I care a lot about. I really want to eradicate identity theft. And I think people like Intellicheck and Jumio help fix that problem, which is a net good, for the consumer as well as for companies. So happy to be here today.
Oh, thank you. Well, so we're gonna talk about a couple different topics today and get your take on them, obviously. And these are pretty items you and I have discussed before in many different cases of varying degrees of detail. But so one of the items that I'd love to get the audience and certainly get your take on is more around kind of the global trends we're seeing across digital identity and what you're seeing start to I'll call it galvanize the way people view it. It had used to be, and I'll try and frame this, is that there was a lot of point solutions out there, right? And even as we look at Jumio from the inception of it when it went forward, and this isn't just about Jumio, it's about anybody that was in that marketplace. There used to be a lot of kind of point solutions that we're putting together.
Yep.
Then people started to kind of pull those together, as you talked about, from an orchestration layer. And now we're looking at much more, I'll call it complete, holistic views of identity. And so as you look at the trends, how are you seeing them, if they vary at all, but how are you seeing them in North America versus kind of globally, and the concerns that are taking place with those?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's probably three large trends that I'd point out just kind of generically. Number one is that consolidation that you were just talking about, Garrett. That there's vendor management issues, that these customers and companies have. There's the technical upkeep and maintenance that they need to do. It creates this kind of spaghetti code and Frankenstein's monster connecting a bunch of different things. And so I think we'll see this year and beyond a lot of consolidation in the space, which means M&A, but also consolidation in purchasing from customers where they'd rather purchase a platform and then get connected, to point solutions after that. So I think that consolidation is one trend that we'll see continuing this year. Number two is a focus on customer experience. Back in the day, all of these companies would compete on the branch experience or the brand or the swag that they give you, the free toaster. Now it's about the digital experience that they have. How smooth can you make the onboarding? How slick can you make your app, and how painless can it be? A real focus. And you were talking about differentiation. I think that's one of the key areas where people fight now. That is how you differentiate. You have a better GUI and a better experience for the customer and make it easier. And all of the compliance and AML and KYC that you and I were talking about feeds into that. And then finally, globally looking at things addressing bias and this notion of zero bias. A lot of the newer trends are around things like biometrics, but the data is woefully inadequate. It's usually EMEA specific or US specific instead of truly global. And so, we as an industry are dramatically improving, and there's a lot of focus in that area. by getting more biometric data out of Asia, out of Africa, out of Middle East, and other places. But I still think it's super important. But I think that's one of the big trends of a lot of focus over the next year or two from companies in order to remove that implicit or explicit bias.
Yeah. No, I think those are spot on, and it actually feeds into kind of the second piece that I was interested in around privacy concerns. So if we look at those things, we have seen over the last, you and I talked about this, we've seen over the last, I'll call it 6 months, maybe a year, around particularly the biometric stuff in these, not only in North America in certain states, around where people are suing the states or suing particular vendors. Let's put it that way, probably closer, that have been, without naming those vendors, but that have been caught up in these things around facial
Sure.
biometrics. I mean, how are you seeing that play into privacy? Because that's something we're seeing kind of in a certain area of states, and then you have this whole area that is, particularly here due to unemployment benefits and all these different things. But really, if you're looking at biometrics and kind of the facial biometrics and people looking at privacy, what's your viewpoint on that?
I think the big shift in biometrics and privacy is the realization by the public and the regular consumer of how important this world is. And I don't think that we give enough credit to someone like Apple. Now, I live in Cupertino, so by law, I have to compliment Apple. But Apple doesn't get enough credit for making the consumer comfortable with biometrics. They did it with fingerprints on the iPhone. They then allowed people to log in with their face. I think now people get how important their facial biometrics are. And I think that leads to the dawning understanding of how important it is to control, those biometrics. So, and Apple, famously, they changed some of their, privacy stances and have had very large impacts on other major technology players by doing that. And it just shows how powerful, this privacy notion is, that the internet used to be founded on anonymity, and now it's founded on identity. And, that's what we're seeing. So now that customers are aware of the issue, I think customers increasingly will want to be controlling their biometrics and how it's used and reused. And I think ultimately companies that can prioritize that transparency or that ability, to control that will end up with competitive differentiation. But I think really the big sea change is it's no longer just companies who understand this; it's actually everyday consumers who are grokking how important it is. And you mentioned states, which are a U.S. thing. In every jurisdiction all over the world, there's like radically different thoughts and policies on it, and it's, I think, going to get way more chaotic over the next year or two, and then it'll maybe consolidate and settle down a little bit with best practices. Because California has its own rule, Vermont has its own rule, Illinois, much less foreign countries. So watch this space. There'll be a lot happening there.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's funny as you go through these. There's little pieces in there of how consumers are starting to, realize there's some aspect of their own identity pieces that they should either protect, control, right? So to date, we've gone through where companies that we've all been a part of and built and grown have effectively been piecing together all of that identity information. And now you're getting to that side, which I think is a great, great lead in where you have talk about Apple kind of making consumers more comfortable with understanding. I'll call them. I used to call them, basically outputs or exhaust of particular identity items that they have, right? Particular attributes of those identities. So now you're in this world where everyone's talking, not everyone, certain groups are talking about self-sovereign identity and also kind of this tokenization of particular aspects of your identity. And FIDO comes into, the world and things like that. So what's your viewpoint on that? Again, that's a big question. Maybe you can consolidate it.
It's an incredibly complex topic. I think what the consumers see, first off, things like GDPR and other things are predicated on the notion of giving more control to people. So I think without necessarily going all the way into self-sovereign identity, there is a larger trend of empowering people to have more influence. over their identity, the right to be forgotten, which I've got a lot of ex-girlfriends I like to invoke that with. But there's these notions that the consumers are trying to understand better, but the consumers are also seeing a lot more fraud. The networks over the last year or two have seen a 60% increase in fraud. It's not just more fraud, it's higher value. So it's compared to pre-pandemic, it's 6% higher than it used to be. And I think even the consumers themselves are worried about this, that they've got assets, that they're worried about an account takeover. They're seeing, people spoofing them on WhatsApp and trying to get hold of their identity. So I think for me, without weighing in on the whole self-sovereign topic, I think the broader trend is greatly increased control over your identity, how and when it's used. And so I think now it's a good thing, now that consumers are more educated about the topic, understand how important it is. We're going to continue to see evolution. There's a lot of froth around regulation and things like that. That, as we talked about, it'll take a couple of years to work out. But overall, there will be an increasing amount of control by consumers and an increasing amount of understanding of how important it is to control some of these things, and that their data not be resold without their knowledge, et cetera.
No, the use case side of it is I mean, there's a lot of different use cases, but you start to put it in the practicality of whether you're boarding online, whether you're going into stores, is that as all of us continue to use, it doesn't matter whether you use a computer, whatever digital device you're using, um, it's really what I'm going to present to you. What's the least amount of information I can present to you to go ahead and not only validate and authenticate and authorize that process, but then the flip side of that is if you're the back end, kind of these platforms like we're talking about, it's how much can I go and grab out of these different areas to try and continue to layer on additional trust, as you talked about in the beginning, that rolls through it. So it would be very interesting as the consumers get more and more educated
Mhm.
that they get into this function as we talked about of just it's not just a unique ID that I want to give you. It's I only want to give you, if you look at the mobile DL area, I want to let you know that I'm 21 and older. I
Right.
only want to let you know those things. You don't need to know anything else about me, right? And so that's kind of the interesting world, which goes into kind of my final question we were talking about earlier was as you look at these things going on, what from a not just a trend perspective, but are there certain things you're seeing that you think are going to be kind of core items?
Yeah, I mean, I think selfishly speaking, we think that document-centric identity, which Gartner will refer to as something like identity proofing, is proving who someone is, so that you know who you're dealing with. Most other areas are identity affirmation, which is providing evidence of who you are. And so I think what we'll see is you need both, and so it's not just all about your ID. It's also you say you're in California, but your IP address shows you're in Shenzhen, China, or other areas. And so I think what we'll see is we believe that the ability to know who you are instead of who you say you are, probably your facial biometrics or foundational biometrics and something like an ID document are the best way to prove who you are. But there's going to be all of these other signals, and I often get asked, what is the killer signal? I actually don't think that is it. I think it's a combination that if you take two signals that are 80% effective and you do both, it's now 98% effective, right? So it's not just how perfect one signal is. By combining multiple different signals together, you can actually get way greater confidence in who you're dealing with. So that's why we'll see voice or the way that you walk or type or other signals that you can get at that'll help build out that 360-degree view that you were talking about.
Is there anything you think we've left off? I know there's a whole world of AML we probably haven't scratched on. That's for another date, in my opinion, at this point. Anything you can think of that's a good finisher for it?
Sure. I think for me, what's super important is how much the world has changed and how foundational identity is to literally every single thing you do in your life. That if you look back at the last week of your life, think about how many times you used a credit card, and think about how many times you used your identity. You used your identity probably 2 or 3 orders of magnitude more times. And so I think what's really exciting for the entire industry and for the whole world is how important this identity topic is. It's for you as a consumer protecting yourself. It's companies, protecting you and your assets, and it's every piece of commerce that you interact with. It's like everything that you do in your life, and that's what I love so much about our space. Is we're shaping the future. We're protecting consumers, and we're the good guys. And I really think over the next couple of years, we will see the understanding of identity just permeate everything, because there's virtually nothing that you do that doesn't have some sort of identity component, and that's really exciting.
Robert, always love having you do this stuff and talking with you. So fun. Thank you again for joining kind of our digital identity stories and rolling through these. And I'm sure we're going to have a follow up one on this thing probably before the end of the year, even diving deeper into AML and identity and how important that is within our overall kind of ecosystem and, quite frankly, our financial systems.
My pleasure. Happy to be one of the digital identity stories, and I look forward to watching all of the other videos as well.